And that's why. Again, even at the front, you probably can't see this very well, let alone at the back. All I want you to look at is the blue column. The blue column is how this country has been doing for all its children in terms of performance against key measures. And then the red column is children at school action, and then school action plus, and then statements, so the other three columns. And what you can actually see, the blue column's done up. This country's actually been really quite good at improving performance within schools. And you look at the other column, the red column, the green column, and the blue column. Broadly, they've all gone up as well. But the gap between the children with SEN disability and everybody else has stayed exactly the same. I'm saying for different children, you may never completely close that gap, but we should, for all children with SEN disability, have the mission of ensuring they can do the best that they possibly can. And if we did that, we know that that gap would decrease to some extent. So we finally have it. And I really just like putting this slide up because for 4 years I've gone around the country talking about when we might get legislation and then talking about draft legislation. So we have the legislation in place. We have a code of practice that hopefully is about to be approved by Parliament. We have the regulations. This is going to happen. And most of what I'm now going to talk about has to be in place by September the 1st. And I'll talk about what that's going to look like. But the basic bottom line is the government says that the things you're going to hear about now have got to be in place by the 1st of September. And the areas I'm going to focus on today, because as I said, there's no way I could deliver everything that's going to change today, are those elements looking from early years through to schools, through to college, about what you could expect to change, and also a little bit about the overall structure in terms of how the local authority is going to operate and what that's going to look like. Now, essentially, what the government is saying, as I've said, is that you've got to move to a more family-based system. And in that, the government have therefore said, and this is actually written into the legislation, now it's clause 19, if anybody wants to go and look it up, a new principle, and this is how the government hopes we're going to get this culture change, this miracle is going to happen, that in all the services that they deliver to you under this legislation, remembering now that this legislation goes from 0 to 25 years old, covers education, health and social care, so it's not just what the schools do for you, it's also what happens in the health service, what happens in social care, that fantastic array of things that's in the marketplace downstairs. It's all of that. It's everything to do with that. And in delivering any of those services, they have to take account of the views, wishes and feelings of the child or young person and the child's parents. Those service providers have to recognise the importance of children, young people and parents being provided with the information and support necessary to enable participation in decisions about your lives, and then the need to make sure that you've got the right information and support to be able to do so. So that's where you get this culture shift in the legislation. So whatever any of those services you were looking at and exploring in terms of that marketplace, there's now much more of a requirement they've got to take into account what you think is appropriate for you and your family in that context. And that's not about you suddenly being able to say, well, this is what I want and they just have to deliver it, but it's about a partnership, a new sort of conversation between you and service providers about what should be available. And then the aim of all of that is to produce the best possible educational or other outcomes. And that's where the government delivers this second bit of the objectives I talked about. So the first bit is all about how parents and young people are involved. And the second bit of the requirement is then that aspiration that for your children they have the best possible outcomes that they could achieve, and how we're going to put the services around them for that to happen. And to do that, and knowing about parental involvement, we do know what makes good parental involvement. Much of it is exemplified in the Charter, but I've just put up here one piece of very significant government evidence that looked at what makes good parental involvement. So what kind of things could you expect to be happening? Parental engagement must be planned for and embedded in whole school and service strategy. So actually you need parents involved in what's happening with schools. And what does the Charter do? It embeds that as a principle with the way parents would be working with schools. And that was part of the learning we got out of looking at the Rotherham Charter and the way it actually worked. That you have to have effective leadership, either at the level of the local authority or at the level of the school or the provision, to make that happen. And that must be proactively looking for parents' views and finding out about parents' views. And then you need a sustained approach, something that happens over time, where you constantly keep going back to parents and asking them for their views. Again, whether it's at the level of the local authority through the local offer, or whether that's at the level of the school or other provision, asking you how it's going, monitoring how it's going, and making the changes when necessary. And so we know how this works. We can do it. Rotherham Charter proves it. What other people have done around the country proves it. And the first place that happens, the government says, is through this strange thing called a local offer. Now, if you Googled local offer a year ago, you probably would have got Tesco's 2 for the price of 1, what we're offering this year. Actually, now if you start to do it, you start to see local offers. And what are local offers? 2 things. First, it's the way in which the local authority consults with parents and young people about the appropriateness of services. So what has to be in place by September, and I saw happening live downstairs, is that parents and young people have to be consulted and involved in shaping what the local offer is. So the local offer is a description of everything that's available in Rotherham for families and children, not just the schools, not just the early provision, not just the colleges, but also the health service, the social care service, whether there's accessible swimming lessons on Wednesday afternoon in the local swimming pool. It's all the things that might be useful to you as families when you're doing this. And there needs to be clarity and transparency around what's in that offer. One of the big things we found, what really drives lack of parental confidence, is when it's not clear what I'm entitled to and why. And that whole issue of resources was mentioned earlier. And the whole point of both of these things is to ensure that for whatever level of resources are available within Rotherham, by actually consulting with the people using those services, you're getting the most appropriate services for the money involved. And those can often be cheaper than service providers would actually imagine they would do on their own. There's a lot of evidence to show that by working together, you get better services as a result of all of this, and often not at extra cost, because parents will find new and different ways of doing things, ways that actually are often more relevant to their family and make it work. And therefore there has to be clarity and transparency then about what is available and how you access it. And there's got to be more information therefore about health and social care and how they're involved in delivering that local offer within Rotherham. And then at the level of schools and early years and colleges, there has to be real clarity about what you can expect from your school, your early years provider or your college, what they're going to provide for the money that they get from the local authority. It used to be 5 years ago, the only question is, what's the local authority ever done for us? And it's a bit like Monty Python, you know, what's the local authority ever done for us? I would advise parents in the room to ask the question at least as often now, what is my school or early years setting or college doing for me? Because actually they now have a lot of the money that used to be with the local authorities. So the conversation can't just be with the local authority anymore. It has to also be with the school and college. And that's what the local offer is trying to also encourage. And I'll come on to the schools bit of that in a minute. And then the local authority is required to take your views about the adequacy of that offer. How good is it? How is it working? Can you get the information you need? And then publish those and then say what they're going to do about where the gaps are. So there's much more of a mechanism of accountability in terms of what that offer looks like. And so the whole aim is to have a different sort of conversation with parents and young people where they're involved in shaping that offer. Again, it's not as simple as saying, well, anything I want I can have. That's not the real world. It's certainly not the real world where we are in terms of budget cuts in local authorities and health and social care at the moment. But therefore, it's an even more of an imperative about how do we all work together to make sure that's going to happen. And a local offer is a major way to have that conversation with schools, with the local authority, with everybody else about how you can make that work. So that's the strategic level, if you like, within the local authority. What about in terms of the provision you all use, those early years settings and schools? What do they have to do? Well, the government's introducing a new 2-year developmental check with the aim of trying to ensure that we pick up children with SEN and disability earlier, and then a real encouragement from early years settings to have early intervention and early support, very much based on that early support principles, in terms of getting the team around the child very early on in the process, and that all settings will have to have a clear process for identifying children with SEN, and also ensuring when they're doing that, that they're not just conflating that with poor performance within schools. So one of the big issues that came out of the Ofsted inquiry was that too often it was felt there wasn't really high quality teaching in schools, and therefore sometimes SEN was being over-identified. So it's got to be really high quality, good quality teaching in schools, and then really good and refined ways of making sure we're identifying children with SEN, and where we do, there's really early intervention about that. And that's made very clear in the Code of Practice. I'm giving you all the references here, so when you look at this afterwards, you'll be able to go back and say, this is what it says in the Code of Practice at this point. And then School Action and School Action Plus are going. That doesn't mean somehow we've abolished schools needing to do something about children with SEN if they haven't got a statement under the current system or an education, health and care plan under the new one. And so schools actually still have to look at, and this is what good schools do already. Good schools do all of this. They look at children that are having trouble accessing the provision in the same way as other children would do. They're looking to see if they're falling behind age-appropriate expectations, and if they are, they're beginning to put together a plan. IEPs are going, if you're familiar with those. That doesn't mean the school doesn't have to put together a plan. The Code of Practice is very clear. The school teacher, working with the SENCO, and the parent and young person has to sit down if they've identified that SEN, agree a plan about how they're going to address that, put it in place, monitor how well it's going on, and if it's not working, do some more. If it's not working, do some more. Bring in specialists, bring in other advice. And if the school has got to a point where they feel they can do no more with that particular child with that additional support, then they are allowed to ask for more support in the form of an education, health and care plan as part of that. And in doing that, they have to be very clear about what it is that they are providing at the school level in terms of support for children with SEN and disability. So the local authority sets out a vision in the local offer about what it's expecting from schools, and then schools do something called an SEN information report, which is a report both back to the local authority and also to parents about what the offer is in relation to SEN and disability within that school. So it's embedding some of those principles within the charter about what's supposed to happen, and that conversation that happens between the school and the parent, and that sense of a kind of quality assurance that there are going to be the services and support within the school to help that happen. And the school's also supposed to use better data and really look very closely at how well are our children with SEN achieving. If they're falling behind, what else can we put in place to ensure that they achieve whatever outcomes they're capable of achieving? From the parent's point of view, this is supposed to ensure that there's a lot more clarity at the school and early years level in terms of what you can expect. So there has to be a clear plan produced, as I was saying, about what we're going to do in relation to your child with SEN, that it must focus on outcomes, that children and young people must be routinely involved in those discussions about the plan, how it's going, and what's changing as part of that. The Code of Practice is very clear that parents must be seen once a term. Must is a statutory responsibility to discuss progress and interventions, and a plan produced and discussed once a year. Now the plan, you must meet with parents at least once a year to produce that plan. The Code of Practice says you should ideally meet parents once a term, okay? And then that SEN report really importantly paints a picture of what would be available locally for you to use. And then there's a clear process for discussing an education, health and care plan if one is needed, and the school knows what it's got to do about that.